Hey guys, so when you get a Currie crate housing and axle package in the mail, you're going to get a box with a housing in it. You're going to get a box like this with axle shafts in it. So what you're going to find in here is an axle with wheel studs pressed in, Currie bearing retainer plate, and then your bearing assembly that includes the seal, the bearing, the race, and the retaining collar. However, as you can see, this is not pressed on. So for various brake applications, you can either press this on or there's some other hardware that needs to be installed on the axle shaft. All right, so when you're installing drum brakes, you've got everything you need with this axle package. That only requires a Currie retainer plate, and that's already here. You just press the bearing on and go with it. If you're doing the Currie Explorer disc brake kit, the Explorer disc brake comes with this spacer ring that has to go on the axle before the bearing assembly. So you'll pull the bearing assembly off, leave this plate on, put the Explorer ring in here, then press the bearing on. That's for Explorer. If you're doing a Wilwood kit, this is what you're looking at here. Wilwood comes with its own plate that would go on the axle. So if you were using this Wilwood plate, you would take the gold Currie retainer plate off, press the bearing on with nothing, and then you would slide the Wilwood plate on. Now, in this Wilwood application, Currie offers our own heavy duty plate. As you can see, it's substantially heavier than the Wilwood plate. So this is a rigid plate, still has the lip on it as the Wilwood plate does. However, this plate absolutely has to go on in replacement of the gold plate. So you would put the black plate on, then press the bearing on, discard the gold plate. That gets you through Wilwood. Your Baer brake, the Baer brake, as you can see, has a notch in it. This goes on the axle shaft after the bearing's pressed on. So you would go ahead and press the bearing on completely with no plate on it whatsoever. And then you would remove this parking brake assembly off of the Baer plate. You'd slide the parking brake assembly onto the axle, slide the caliper bracket plate onto the axle, and then you would bolt it up, and you'd have washers and nuts right in these recesses that would bolt it up solid to the housing. So let's go take a look at how we press these on. So for the sake of instructional purposes here, we're going to show you how you would assemble this for a drum brake. So you're going to have your gold Currie retainer plate that comes with the axle. That goes on first. You're going to have your axle seal. You have your tapered bearing and race assembly. You have your bearing retaining collar. Now that's all stacked up, we'll have somebody press it on here for us. All right guys, so now that our bearing assembly is pressed onto the axle, the next thing we recommend is putting some black grease on the axle seal to allow it to go in smoother into the housing end. And then we're also going to go up and we're going to put some grease on the splines just to aid it in lining up into the third member and smooth installation. So in your housing and axle package, you'll find the T-headed bolts and lock nuts. So you'll put these through the housing ends, and you can see I've already put a drum brake backing plate on here for illustration with 3 of the T-bolts coming through from the back. Put the last bolt in there, and now we're ready to install the axle shaft. So you want to line up the bearing through the hole in the backing plate and into the housing end. And you want to line up the 4 holes on the retainer plate with the T-bolt threads. So with the axle started into the housing, it's not uncommon to have to use a mallet to get the axle all the way in and seated where it needs to be. Okay, so as you can see now, I've got the axle knocked in with a mallet. I've got all the T-bolt nuts started, so now we can go ahead and tighten the axle into the housing. So as you guys can see, there's one large hole in the axle face. That hole is there so that you can put your socket through the axle face to snug down the T-bolt nuts as so. So when the nuts are snug, you'll notice that the plate is not seated completely against the backing plate. What's happening here is that the seal is wanting to crush into the hole now. So at this point, going forward, tightening these nuts, I'm going to go corner to corner on these nuts as if you were torquing a wheel so that you evenly crush that seal into the hole. So because of the load on the gold Currie retainer plate, as it crushes the seal, you'll see that there's a little slight gap along here. That's completely normal. You're tight here, the backing plate is completely tight. So this bow is nothing to be concerned with at all. Your last step of this process is just torque the 4 nuts down to 35 foot-pounds.